Welcome back to part 2 for this Android Studio SqLite Database tutorial series. So in our last video we set up our constants and made our packages for our model, our data and our adapter. In this video we're going to be adding the code to our database handler. We're going to be adding a save functionality and a delete functionality. As I said in the previous video, if there's any other functionalities you want me to cover for the SqLite database, just let me know in the comments below. Okay, let's get started on this video. So database handler is going to extend SqLite Open Helper. And then we're going to implement the methods by right-clicking here, or by left-clicking here. You can right-click and grabbing these two methods here. So we also need to grab one more method. That's our super constructor. So what we're going to do is we're just going to get rid of the nullable, and we're just going to leave the context. And then for our context, we're going to leave it there. For the name, we can grab the database name from our constants. So we just need to say constants.database name. Factory will be null, and the version, again, we just go constants.database version. So whenever the database name or the database version wants to be updated, we just need to update it via our constants class, and we don't need to go through each instant in our database handler. So next thing we need to do in our onCreate is just to create the table. So we say string, and we'll call this SqLite tutorial table, where we will say create table. And then we need to put in each of the columns which we want to create. So the first we need to do is put in our table name. So we go constants, table name, plus, and then we open our brackets, put space first, and then we define each of our columns. So the first column is our key, and that's going to be of an integer which auto increments. So integer primary key auto increment, comma, space. Then we move on to the next one, which is going to be our input. And that's just going to be a string. I think that's it. So to finish off, we just need to not have a comma, we need to have a closed bracket, and then a semicolon inside, and then outside. So we've got the table name, the column, the row ID, and then the actual input from our edit text. The only thing we need to do apart from that is actually create the table. So we need to go database, and then we just need to put in the name of the table which we've created, which we've specified up here. In our update, we just need to say that if the table is going to be updated, we need to drop the table and then replace it with the updated table. We say drop table if exists, and then we replace it with the new table, constants table name. So the only thing else we need to do here is just create the new table. There we go. Okay, so this is where we'll start doing our methods for our save and our delete. So we'll say public void, and we'll say save. What we're going to do is create a model of the item which we're going to save, and we're going to use that in our database. So what we'll do is we'll make that first. So if we go to our model, right click, new, and go Java class, and we can just call this item. So the item is going to implement serializable. Then what we need to do is create our variables. We need to say private, and we're going to have a string, and we're going to have our input. This is from our edit text. And if there's any other factors you want to add into your item, for example, if you've got other factors like other strings or other integers, or whether it's ticked or unticked, you add all those here. And what we need to do as well is we'll just say private static final long serial version. $10L. We can right click and go generate, and we can generate a constructor which has all of the private values which we've just defined. Perfect. And the next thing we need to do is create an empty constructor. So again, just right click, generate constructor, and make sure it's empty. And lastly, what we need to do is generate the getters and setters. What our item class is doing is we're setting an input, and every time we call the input, we can get the input and we can set the input in our application. So we go right click and generate, go getters and setters, and then we need the getter and setter for both of these. Perfect. So if we now close this and go back to our database, we can use the database to save items which we just created. So we say item, and we just call it item. So what we're going to say is we're going to say SqLite Database. We're going to abbreviate it to DB for database. And we say this.get writable. Now here we need to put in our values which we are saving. So we need to say content values equals values, new content values. And here we just need to put in each of the values which we're saving to our database. So we say values.put, and then we need to say which column we're putting the data into and what the data corresponds to. So we're obviously going to say constants, and we want to put the data into our edit text column. And what we're going to populate it with, we're going to define it as item, and we're going to get the input. So when we go to our main activity, we're going to set the input, and then in our database, we're going to get the input. Simple as that. And then to actually insert it, we say database, insert, and then we need to say where it's going to be inserted to, so the table name, so constants.table name, null, and then what values do we put in? The values which we just defined. So obviously here I'm just showing you one example of putting in one value, but if you had multiple, you just add more here, and in your item model class, you'll add as many getters and setters as you need. What I can also show you is the delete. Or for first, what I'll do is I'll show you how to get all of the items which we've saved into our database. So say public And this is if we're going to be saving data into our database, we're going to save it into an array list. So it's a private array list or public array list. And it's going to be of type item. And what we can call this, so we can say get all items. Okay. So what we need to do here is obviously create an array list, which we're going to then populate with data we save from our main activity. So if we go back up to the top here and we create this, so we say private final array list of type item, and we can call this database list, and that's going to be a new array list. Okay, so when we're getting all the items from our database, we first of all need to make sure that the list is clear. And then we need to get the data or any new data which has been added to the database. So we need to say SqLite Database equals database. And this time we need to get readable because we're not writing to the database, we're just reading from it. And we use a cursor to look through our database. So we say cursor, and we're doing so we need to implement this, or import it I should say, and we say database.query. So what are we querying? We're querying our table, so we say table name, and then we need to look for certain string or column titles, so we say new string. And then we put in our column titles which we're searching in curly brackets. So we say constants again, dot database edit text, and the rest can be all null. Okay. Obviously, if you have more rows and more columns, you'll add your other column IDs in a list sort of fashion here. So you'd say constants dot whatever your other columns are. So what we could do, for example, is we could also say constants dot key ID, just in case we were searching for it via the key ID. What we can do now is we have to have a loop to move the cursor through the database. So we say if cursor.move to first, then we need to do the following. So do, so we say item equals new item, and we say that the item dot set the input, and the input's going to be equal to what we get from our database, and that's going to be cursor dot get string, and in our string we're going to say cursor dot get column index, and we're getting our edit text column. So what's happened here? So the problem is I've got get toString, not get string. There you go, not necessary, but I always like to put it in just in case. And then what we need to do is we need to say that we need to add the data to our list. So we say list.add, and then we're adding the item. And then we say while it's doing that, you move to the next, and so on and so forth. So to end, we just need to close the cursor, close the database, and we obviously need to return our list. So while we're in our database handler, what we'll do is we'll add our delete as well. So it's a public void, and we'll call this delete item. And what we'll say is we'll say SqLite Database equals database, and we'll say this dot get writable. Again, we're writing to the database, we're changing it, we're not just reading from it. So we say database dot delete, and we're deleting from our table. So we say constants dot table name. We're going to be deleting each row as an individual row. So we're going to click on the row and come up with an option to delete. So when we are pressing the delete button, we need to take into account the key ID of that row. So we say constants dot key ID. So we're saying if key ID plus equals question mark. So what we're going to say is if the key ID equals a new key or a unique key, so new string, and then we're going to get the value of the ID of that row, then we delete it. Say value of ID. And then in our brackets at the top here, we're going to specify the ID. Okay, so before we move on, I just want you to go to our items class, and we need to put in an item ID. That's for us to use our delete method, which we've just made up in our database handler. And we need to say int, and we'll say this is called item ID. So here we just need to add it. So we say this dot item ID, and we just need to add it up the top here, int item ID can be equal to item ID. Go down here, right click, generate getters and setters. We need the ID. So I think that's a good place to stop for this video. It's getting a little bit long as it is. In the video, we covered the SqLite Database class where we made a save function and a delete function. And we also implemented a model class. So this was a class in which we could set and get certain attributes for our model. In this case, we're just using an item as a model, and we're using the attributes of a string from the edit text and a int with the key ID. Obviously, if you wanted to make something more complicated, you could add it to your model class and then implement that in the data handler as I've shown in this video. Okay, looking forward to seeing you in the next video where we talk about the adapter and then wiring it all up into a fully working app.